بعد كتابه ولا شريعة بعد شريعته ولا صحابة بعد صحابته أما بعد فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أفرأيت من اتخذ إلهه هواه وأضله الله ولا علم وختم على سمعه وقلبه وجعل على بصره غشاوة صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Today, inshallah, we will be talking about secularism, namely what are its forms, what do we mean by that, and I think we can preface with a number of questions, right? And I think, as Muslims, the primary role of the Muslim is that he or she will be responsible in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment. So the first act of a Muslim is mas'uliyah, right? The idea of responsibility. We will all be answerable to Allah on the Day of Judgment, right? And this is the first and foremost sort of act as Muslims, as bodies, as souls, as hearts, and as an entire, sort of human being. And the questions that I want to ask is, namely, what is secularism? What does secularism offer us? What are the forms of secularism? Why are Muslims being asked to adopt secularism? Why are some countries considered secular and some other countries are not considered secular? What is the difference between secularism and liberalism? How can Muslims respond? How can Muslims react? And how can Muslims have a dialogue with people who come from that tradition? I think the first and foremost thing is understanding where did secularism come about. Before the 16th century, the word secular was primarily used in a Catholic sort of setting. Obviously, we have the Protestant Reformation that happens in the 16th century under Martin Luther. We spoke about that a couple of days ago, where he felt that the clergy was monopolizing faith. He felt that the clergy was a source of oppression in the land. The clergy, namely part of the Catholic state in Italy and Rome, had a large say both politically and socially and intellectually on that world, and he felt that the clergy was holding sort of Christians back from really unlocking their relationship with God and Jesus alayhi salam. And so what he did was he inspired the Protestant Reformation, which was this idea that the clergy have no role, that everyone has unmediated, independent access to God. They don't need a clergy, they don't need authority. The only authority is the Bible, right? So you don't need to mediate yourself. Because in that world, the world that Martin Luther lived in, first of all, the Ottomans were advancing towards Vienna. As we know, the farthest the Muslims got into Europe was Vienna. Vienna is located in modern-day Austria. It's pretty much in the heart of Europe. Sultan Sulaiman al-Qanuni in the 16th century besieges it. He loses that siege, and 100 years later, his great-grandson Sultan Mehmed IV also besieges Vienna. The distance between Constantinople, which is the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and Vienna is ways and ways apart. They fail in both sieges. So Martin Luther is born in a world where Islam is truly the only dominant religion in the world. And there is this fear, in many of his writings he discusses sort of the threat of the Turks, what he calls the barbarians, and that he felt that Christianity was not able to sort of match up to the sort of empire of Muslims, the civilization of Muslims. And there is this deep fear and insecurity, and he felt that the Christian civilization was not intellectual enough. This spurs what we know as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a long project of various philosophers, artists, architects, political thinkers, people like Kant, Hobbes, Rousseau, John Locke, etc., and so forth. And they really complete this project, right? And which is to separate religion from politics, from worldly life. That is, religion is here, it's in your home, and religion cannot be in the public life. And this is why even the idea of secular comes from a Latin word that means time. And this idea that sacred time with God, which is very interesting because in the Quran, Allah quotes the mushrikeen as saying, وَمَا يُهْلِكُنَا إِلَّا الدَّهْرِ, that only time will destroy it. So the word time, and the word dahr in Arabic, and the word secular in Latin actually have almost a one-to-one meaning with each other, which is very curious to me. And obviously, as we know, with the rise of colonialism that began with the British taking over Bengal in 1765, and Napoleon Bonaparte landing in Cairo and Alexandria in 1799, really begins this forced dialogue. I say forced because Muslims of that time were only sort of coerced to reckon with these ideas because of the power of the European gun and cannon, right? Napoleon was bombing our cities, and many Muslim thinkers like Rifa'i al-Tahtawi and Shawilillah Muhaddid Dahlawi saw a need to sort of engage with European and Western ideas, the most primary of which was secularism, right? And in that time they understood it as liberalism. Liberalism coming from the word liberte in Latin to mean freedom, right? The idea in liberalism is that you have full autonomous freedom to do with yourself what you want, right? And nobody can infringe on that except for the state, and we'll discuss those contradictions later. Is everyone with us? Okay, that's just a brief sort of historical lesson. I think that as Muslims, who sort of have felt the weight of that, right? Many of our Muslim countries, we spoke about this a couple days ago, where when colonialism started, and I mention this because colonialism has shaped so much of our Muslim experience. Every sphere of life is dominated by the sort of colonial experience, and I don't think there's any sort of way of escaping with it. We have to speak to it. In the same way that Imam Ghazali felt that the Greek Aristotelian thought was so inflected in Muslim civilization at that time that Muslims had to respond, right? And the Quran comes as a book of dialogue, right? The most common word in the Quran, does anybody know? It's a verb. Is the word قَالَ يَقُولُ, he said, right? Or they said, right? That's this idea of speech. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala quotes many dialogues in the Quran. Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam and Fir'aun, right? In Surah Shu'ara. Or Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam in Nimrud, in Surah Baqarah, right? There are many of these dialogues, and this idea of that human speech is really fundamental to the exchange of ideas, as I have been stressing, right? And as Muslims, and it's important for us to know the world that we live in. The Quran, as divine revelation, is intimately familiar with the ideas of the mushrikeen, of the Jewish tradition, of the Christian tradition, of earlier traditions, right? And as Muslims, especially of those of us who live as a minority in America, we must be familiar of where you are, where you live. The Holy Prophet ﷺ says, "Salima man ya'rif lisan qawmih." That person is safe. He who knows the language of that people, the expression of that people, right? So in order to protect ourselves, we have to know sort of the climate that we're living in, intellectually and politically. I think that secularism, we have to divide it into three types. The first is secularity, the second is secularization, and the third is secularism. Secularity means this whole sort of package of ideas that came from Europe from the 16th to the 19th century, right? Secularization means sort of any country that's sort of aspiring to engage in this. Secularism, we mean divorcing religion from state, putting religion in the private sphere, prioritizing rationality and empiricism and science over all other forms of knowledge. And then we have secularism, which is the political manifestation of that, right? Where the state sort of imposes its will, right? So for example, when Russia colonized Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, rather the Soviet Union did in the early 20th century, they forbade any expression of Islam in the public sphere. Adhan could not be called, madrasas could not, so 1,000-year-old madrasas in Samarkand and Bukhara were shut down. Mind you, the Soviet Union was a secular, atheist empire, right? But they forbade any expression of religion. And you can see the effects of that today when you visit Uzbekistan. I mean, Islam is now sort of resurging, but it's in the aftermath of this, right? Of political secularism, where religion cannot be manifested in the public sphere, right? The only ideas that can be manifested in the public sphere are liberal, rational ideas. But then obviously it sort of comes that whose idea of rationality and whose idea of liberalism. In Islam, it's very interesting because the second verse of Surah Baqarah starts off with ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ. That this Quran is a book that has no doubt in it. There is no doubt in it, and this is very interesting because secularists often call themselves skeptics, people who have doubt, right? So the Quran, the second ayah of Surah Baqarah is rejecting this idea that faith and the idea of the good and virtuous life begins with removing doubt from your life. So it's almost, opposing sort of conceptions of life. And this idea of the ghaib. The ghaib in Jahiliyyah in Arabic, you'll see it in, Jahili, pre-Islamic poetry, all it meant to a sort of Arab was anything that you could not see, right? And the Quran uses this Arabic word ghaib to mean everything of the unseen, right? And so it's very interesting that the Quran is sort of acknowledging that the Quraysh and the pagans of Mecca are, in some sense, obviously secularism is birthed in the 18th, 19th century, but there is this sort of proto-secular conception of life amongst the Jahiliyyah, right? That the life is only confined to this world, right? There are many ayat in the Quran that discuss what they say, that are we really going to be resurrected? Is there really something beyond this world? Is there a life after this life? Right? So the Quran is sort of addressing these ideas because these ideas are not necessarily new in the way that many of them would like you to believe, right? And I think another important question to remember is that when Muslim countries were becoming independent from various empires such as the British Empire, the German Empire, the French Empire, or even the Soviet Empire, that freedom and that liberation was always preconditioned on how secular the country would be, right? So when you read the news and stuff, and even various think tanks and research policy reports, you'll see that the report is how secular is this country. Or, for example, Pakistan or Afghanistan is moving away from secular ideas, right? This is the sort of dynamic, right? And I think the first question that we need to ask is, are Muslims allowed to be free to think what they want to think, right? This is really the question, that can Muslims think, right? Because, whether in America or Europe, even though they sort of promote this idea of free thought and free speech, they would never take ideas of Islam or Islamic civilization seriously as ideas to learn from, right? And so, or even Muslims in their own countries are forbidden from thinking in the values of Islam. I think about, in various Muslim countries, when you go to elite sort of circles, whether the military circles or the elite English-speaking classes, if you wear the hijab, for example, right, or if you speak your own tongue, that is seen as a sign of backwardness. Right? And you have to ask that, why is it in a country like Pakistan or Egypt or Syria that if you're speaking the language of your people and you're following the religion of your people, that is seen as backward? And, this is that sort of crisis that I'm alluding to, that many Muslim countries suffer. Right? And so how do we as Muslims address that crisis? Right? Because this is a crisis of philosophy, this is a crisis of thought, this is a crisis of politics that we have all been suffering for so long. And as Muslims, to draw upon our tradition and to think and to create our own systems of thought, we are not allowed to do that. What happens, when Muslims promote Islamic values in their lands? They're sanctioned, right? There are reports written that if Muslims don't abide by these value systems, that they are, criticized, sanctioned, demonized, etc., and so forth. So I think that first and foremost, that we need to understand that secularism itself is its own political project, i.e. that it contains its own set of values. In the same way that Christianity, Hinduism, they all contain their own set of values. Secularism, as a child of Protestant Christianity, contains its own values, right? This idea that no religion can inform political life. No religion can inform social life. No religion can inform any type of public life. Whereas in Islam, the first idea of Islam, that Islam is a deen. It's a holistic form of life, right? That religion, that if you believe in Islam, right, that spirituality, that ruhaniyah is going to impact every single aspect, every single thought in life. One of the poor translations of sharia is that they translate it as Islamic law. Sharia is more than Islamic law. Sharia is also a sort of way of life. When the classical fuqaha, muhaddithin, and mutakallimin discuss sharia, they don't mean it just in terms of law. The way that you enter a bathroom, the way that you eat food, the way that you treat your elders, right? The way that you enter a home, the way that you build a home, the way that you have interactions with other human beings on a private level. All of that is part of the sharia. The sharia informs all of that, right? So the sharia is so much more than law, right? It's a metaphysical and ethical way of living in this world. So what secularism, its first project does is that it undercuts sort of the project and the aspirations of what a Muslim wants for his or her life. If you were to ask a Muslim, before colonialism, that where does Islam, abide in your life? And he would say, in all of my life, right? That in my relationships, in my schooling, in my education. That's why, when you look at Islamic texts and Islamic manuscripts, no matter what genre it is, whether it's medicine, whether it's law, whether it's art, whether it's architecture, even whether it's music. You know, treatises on qawwali, right, on Hindi rags, they would start off, right, with praise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, salawat on the Prophet, and I'm doing this for the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the dunya and the akhirah are inextricably linked in the form of Islam, right? And to separate that in any form of life is going to cause a sense of fawda. Fawda in Arabic means a chaos, a rupture, right? And so that's why in the Muslim world, despite 100 years of colonialism and 100 years of Western coercion and imposition on Muslim countries, Muslims still want Islam in their life. In the 1930s, 1940s, many Western thinkers believed that religion was phasing out. As we can see in the Muslim world, that is absolutely not true, right? Muslims still want Islam to dominate, rule, and govern their life, right? And so this idea that everyone somehow is no longer wants to follow a religion or wants to be religious, we're all going to be sort of free-thinking rationalists and atheists, it's clearly not true. Even in the Muslim world, the majority of Muslims, election in and election out, keep voting for parties, whether we see them as truly Islamic, but at least parties that promote Islamic values, at least, in terms of, superficially, right? And so as Muslims, to think about how do we exit this, right? How do we develop an approach and a philosophy that can provide Muslims an alternative to this, right? And, that's why the great Moroccan thinker, Abdul Rahman, says that what secularism does, and he calls secularism dahraniya. Dahraniya from that word dahr, right? That same ayah in the Quran, وَمَا يُهْلِكُنَا إِلَّا الدَّهْرِ, that the pagan Arabs would say that only time would destroy us, right? There is no creator, there's nothing, only time will destroy us. So this idea, right, that Muslims, or rather that seculars who believe only in this limited dunya, want to impose that vision on us. Right, that they don't want other Muslims to have this holistic conception of life, because, and as I keep reminding and emphasizing, that as a Muslim, your first act of shahada is linking all of these worlds together, right? Alam al-arwah, alam al-shahada, alam al-ghayb, alam al-mahshar, alam al-firdaus, alam al-jahannam, all of these things together. As Maulana Rumi said, Adami deed ast, baqi pust ast, deedan bashad ke deede dost ast. That all of man is skin, right? And he only has vision. This is the only reality of a human being that he can see with his heart. Didan bashad kadide dost ast. That true vision is seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. True vision is living with this idea of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that affects all forms of life. And so I want you guys to hear this hierarchy. So Abdul Rahman creates this hierarchy of secularism. He says that first we start off with dunyaniya. Dunyaniya is worldliness. Dunyaniya is this idea of secularism, where that everything is only confined to this world, that nothing else exists outside of this world, and nothing else other than this world should affect this world. Whereas with Islam, we're saying that dunya, first of all, dunya comes from the word dunu or adna, which means lower, right? And sama, right, or akhirah is something that's higher. So something that's higher should affect the values of the lower world. Right? Why should the values of the lower world affect the values of the lower world? This idea of what is the Prophet? وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. That the Prophet is upon supreme ethics, alayhi salatu wasalam, because he has the values and the ethics of the ghayb, of the unseen, right? Of the attributes of the angels. Right? So the idea of Islam is that the values of the heavens, the values of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are affecting and judging and governing this world. Right? And so you have this broad category of dunyaniya, and then under that you have dahraniya, which is again just blatant atheism, and then next to that you have almaniya. Almaniya is a word that Arab Christians coined in Lebanon and in Syria in the 19th century to translate secularism, and Taha Abdul Rahman believes that the only conclusion of secularism, or rather one of the intended aims of secularism, is separating religious ethics from normal rather from secular ethics. So separating religious ethics from secular ethics. Because all of these values in this world, if you guys have ever spoken to someone who, considers themselves secular or liberal, they say that, why do we need religion? Just be a good person. We don't need religion, just be a good person. We all know how to treat people. We all know what's good in our heart, right? This is what they say. But this idea that Taha says is that you cannot separate that idea of goodness from religion. because the idea of goodness itself comes from Christianity, from the idea of brotherhood, right? This idea, or another secular idea, is that you have to be loyal to the state. Taha says that that idea of being loyal to the state is derived from being loyal to God, right? Or this idea that we must obey secular or our national law is derived from the Christian idea of obeying Christian law, right? So these ideas are literally taken out from religion, and then they're made temporal, i.e. temporary, and they're separated from their base, transcendent, and religious values, right? So this idea, and which is why that we see today that there is such a chaos of values that nobody can agree on anything. We see, even the political parties in America, the political parties in France, even the political parties in Pakistan, because they have no objective way to judge anything. And in Islam, we're saying that the only objective reality is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you base a value system in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're ensuring what? An objective value system, right? And so this idea of almaniyah, which is faslul akhlaqi an ad-din, right? Which is separating ethics from religion. Whereas with Islam, right, we're saying that no ethic can be derived unless it is totally suffused and permeated with religious values, i.e. What is the core religious value? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, قَالُوا بَلَا, right? That when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked us, أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ قَالُوا بَلَا شَهِدْنَا قَالُوا بَلَا شَهِدْنَا أَن تَقُولُوا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ إِنَّا كُنَّا عَنْ هَذَا غَافِلِينَ. That Allah asked us this when Allah split all of the souls of Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam, and we all stood in the world of souls, alam al-arwah, and Allah asked us, am I not your Lord? And we said what? قَالُوا بَلَا شَهِدْنَا. Of course, you are our Lord. The word bala becomes bale in Farsi, which means yes, and in Punjabi it becomes what? Balle, balle. So that idea of balle, balle is actually a qur'ānic word. So Farsi came into India, and then that bale just meant yes, and they would always use it as a sort of joyful word. So whenever you hear that in your PSA, that's actually a qur'ānic allusion and word that came through the Farsi civilization into Punjab. And so this idea is that in Islam, any ethical action starts with the acknowledgement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as our khaliq, right? As our creator, right? And which is why, this is a totally separate discussion of, when you take all of the 99 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the names of beauty, Asma'ul Husna, you derive values from that. If you look at the works of Imam Ghazali, Imam Razi, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Arabi, Shaykh al-Akbar, you see, and they have all written commentaries on the 99 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You'll see that you derive a value from those names, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Razzaq, that He is the sole sustainer and provider. So that all of your sustenance in life, whether materially or emotionally, is rizq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that will govern the way that you see life, right? That is a true ethic. Whereas in secularism, and by the way, capitalism can only survive when you have secularism. I.e. that you create the markets, right? And markets rule and govern life, and which spurs obviously consumerism, and then spurs neoliberalism, and all of that come together to do what? To create human being as simply a statistic, right? Which removes this idea that we are shahideen, that we are bearing witness, right? So three things, right? I would say that sort of go against the secular vein in Islam. 3 verses of the Quran. So the first is أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ قَالُوا بَلَا شَهِدْنَا أَن تَقُولُوا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ إِنَّا كُنَّا عَنْ هَذَا غَافِلِينَ. And that word very ghafil, because secularism is ghafil of the akhirah. Secularism is ghafil. Ghafil means unaware or forgetful or negligent. The second ayah is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّا عَرَضْنَا الْأَمَانَةَ عَلَى السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَالْجِبَالِ فَأَبَيْنَ أَن يَحْمِلْنَهَا وَأَشْفَقْنَا مِنْهَا وَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانُ إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. That again, in pre-time, in azali time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala offered this trust, this amana, this sacred trust, right? Of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of our own free will to who? To the heavens, to the earth, and then to the mountains. And they all, فَأَبَيْنَا, and they refused. وَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانُ. The insan, they carried that amana, that trust. إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. In truth, insan, or humans, are extremely oppressive and extremely ignorant. ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. But this idea that as Muslims, as human beings, we all are mu'tamineen. We all carry this amana, we all carry this trust from the heavens, right? And the purpose of us as Muslims is that we are khalifas on this earth. وَهُوَ الَّذِي, we just heard the ayah today. Any of the all of the hafaz left? It's okay. وَهُوَ الَّذِي جَعَلَكُمْ خَلَائِفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. Allah has made all of you khalifas. Allah has made all of you trustees on this earth. This is the idea of the amana, that we carry this trust. Right? And secularism will never acknowledge that, right? That there are so many problems in this world. I mean, just thinking about the environmental destruction of this world, of this planet, that has only happened in the past 200 years. By the way, which is, the only, which is the direct consequence of European and American capitalism. And now they blame Muslim countries, right? They blame third world countries for this problem. Who started this problem? Right? But now, even though it's a European American problem, it's now seen as a human problem. But who started the problem in the first place? Because as Muslims, we saw a qadasa, we saw a qudsiyya, a sacredness to all of nature. That all of this is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we as human beings must protect it. Right? Secularism and capitalism and liberalism, as much as they try to sort of fix it and create, sort of this green energy sort of system and program, that will never be able to address these problems, because these problems lie on a core fundamental thing of who created this. Is there sacredness in this? And if so, right, then who put that sacredness there? I've read a lot of sort of secular books on environmental protection and conservation, and many of them struggle on this basic thing of how do we provide sacredness to a tree or to a forest. Whereas in Islam, that question was already answered, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the creator of this, has provided sacredness in this. And a last verse that I will recite, and we can end there inshallah. Allah says in the Quran, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ سُرَجَاتِهِ أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ. Have you seen that person who has taken his own rationality as his God? فَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ. So Allah has deprived him of knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is this idea of so much of this world, so much pain, so much chaos, so much wandering. Truly we are all Majnoon in the desert. And I think, not to be sarcastic, but Majnoon's idea in the desert was that he didn't know where his home was. He was lost, right? He was trying to find his beloved, but he could never find it, going from here, going from there. We all know the famous story of Layla Majnoon. The great Indian Persian poet Mirza Ghalib said that, for 1,000 years, Arabic and Farsi poets wrote about, Majnoon trying to find Layla, Layla never reciprocating, Majnoon's flirtations, etc. So he says, Mirza Ghalib, this is totally separate, but he says, Mani'e wahshate kharami hai Layla kon tha, khane-e Majnoon sahra gard bay darwaza tha. He says, who stopped Layla from coming to Majnoon? Majnoon had no door in the desert. Right? And so this idea of that as Muslims, we need to make sure that we are not blindly adopting. And a final point is that we as Muslims need to stop doing taqleed, or blindly adopting Western values and systems. And I have seen this time and time again. Many Muslim reformists and many Muslim people who consider themselves intellectuals, all they do is blindly adopt value systems of America and the West, and then they come to our Muslim lands and they present it as new thought. Whereas they're just blindly adopting those systems and importing it to our lands. I mean, what happened in Afghanistan? So all those Afghans went to Russia and they came back to Afghanistan, and then they said that if you don't follow these thoughts, you're jahil. If you don't follow communism, you're jahil. Right? And so, it's not like they thought of those systems themselves. They were just importing it from Russia. Same thing in Pakistan, same thing in India, same thing, in Iran. All of these things. But as Muslims, we want نحن نريد أن نكون أحرارنا في ديننا وفي فلسفتنا. That we as Muslims want to be free in our religion, we want to be free in our philosophy, and we want to escape, people who coerce us to blindly following other civilizations. That we as Muslims seek freedom, but in a different way. There's so much more to say. Obviously I didn't want to speak about liberalism and conceptions of freedom, but all of that is derived from this idea of secularism. And I think that if as Muslims we can offer and we can blaze a new path for all of these sort of non-Muslims who are seeking a path forward, who are seeking, whether that's how to conceive of ethics in environmentalism, how to conceive of ethics in politics, how to conceive of ethics in law. We as Muslims have so much to offer, and if we can do that, if we can do the tabligh, فَإِنَّمَا عَلَيْكَ الْبَلَاغ, we can again offer a solution to so many world's problems and bring shifa and bring healing and bring beauty. Right? Bring Allah's names are وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. Allah has the beautiful, gorgeous names, the gorgeous attributes. We can offer much and much.